Hello, welcome back to Being Black with Camille Smith, and today we are welcoming Camille Bethune-Brown. Camille is a queer, disabled Black history curator working at the intersection of race and disability studies. She's an expert of late 19th and 20th century African American culture and historiography in the relation to the emergence of museums and memory making. Camille offers spirited conversations creating inclusive stories about the past. She believes in thought-provoking conversations that force Americans reckoning with this collective past. Throughout Camille's education and experiences, she's had the opportunity to share inclusive history and culture with a wide, diverse audience while working with some of the most influential institutions and talented professionals in the field. I'm so excited to be talking with you today. And to give the viewers a little bit of background, I am an avid follower of Antiracismdaily. And for those of people that don't know who that is, it's basically a really, really huge Instagram platform that puts out basically anti-racism education on a regular basis. And they keep you up to date with current events that are happening. And it's just an overall very great platform to keep up to date on these types of things. And for Black History Month, they had basically an email series that they had 20 Days of Black History. So of course I signed up. It was a free newsletter that they put out every single day towards the evenings. And the first day of Black History Month, I got the email, was super excited about it, and scrolled down and I was reading it. I was like, I wonder who makes these, right? And I scrolled down and I saw Camille's name. So I was like, what? That's my name. That's so cool. Then I decided to be a little bit FBI and tried to find her on Instagram. I was lucky and I did find her and I followed her. And then I took the leap of faith to actually talk with her today. So again, I'm super excited to be talking with you. And I am so excited to hear what valuable information and just about your experiences as a whole. So instead of me rambling, I'm going to ask you the first question. What does being Black mean to you?
Oh, wow. Well, so first of all, thank you so much, Camille, for the lovely introduction. I'm glad that you loved my work with Antiracism Daily, and I'm glad that it just spoke to you on such a deep level. Being Black to me is a lived, collective, shared experience that at its core really just means to me, the melanin that unites all of us. Being Black is not just how I appear on the outside, but it is every fiber of my being on the inside. It is from the way I wear my hair to how I speak to really how I move about in the world and in time and space. And particularly when I think of Blackness, I think of it as sort of a liberatory celebration of just a variety of shades and collective experiences that are here to really just draw people in. You know, there's something about this Blackness that is not only inviting, but it makes people want to get up, get excited, and learn a little bit more about it, particularly people, that aren't Black. But even within the Black community, there's just something about Blackness that it's similar to a warm hug. You just want to be pulled in and held close and embrace the culture and embrace the feeling within.
And when did you first find out that you were Black? Do you have a concrete
Oh, yes.
recall?
So I jokingly like to say that I didn't realize I was Black per se, probably until my late teens. And the reason I say that, I mean, obviously I knew I have melanin in my skin, but I grew up in a mixed race family, and I'm a older millennial, and I had this idea that racism was a thing of the past, that hey, we had elected President Obama, like it was a new day. And I just didn't have a clue. Like I truly, I grew up actually right outside of Annapolis, Maryland, and it's a very, very, very white area. And I never felt treated differently until I went to high school. And my later high school years is when President Obama was elected. And that was the first time that I'm like, oh, wait a minute. I'm starting to hear comments like, well, of course you'd vote for him because you're Black, from like white classmates, or like, um, or, oh, you're so articulate, you're so, just language like that. And that was truly like the first time that I'm like, okay, wait a minute, we're not in this post racial where we don't see color kind of a thing. And it's so funny because at that time when I started to kind of when the switch went off, um, I would not have said that those comments like, "Oh, you speak so well," things like that. I wouldn't have said that those were racist statements. I just like I don't want to say I took it as a compliment, but I just didn't have a clue. And as time went on, I'm like, oh, wait a minute, like, let's unpack this. Let's unpack these microaggressions and why certain language, why certain white folks feel like it's okay to say that. What do they mean when they say that? Why do they think this is a compliment? And so, yeah, I like to say that I realized I was Black, or how society viewed me, like 16, 17, 18 years old. And then from there, I went to college, I became an African American history major. And I like to say that I then dove headfirst into all things Blackness.
So, how was it growing up in your area? You talked a little about you grew up near Annapolis.
Yeah.
Growing up, and how did that kind of change as you just grew up, or when you went to college?
Yeah, yeah. So as I mentioned, I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood. I come from a military family, and so moving a lot, things like that. Meeting, like I've always had a very diverse group of people, friends, things like that. Parents, friends around me. So I always considered myself to like be pretty open-minded and really just like I've always known people of different backgrounds. But in the same regard that I kind of didn't, I accepted people as they were, I just had this idea that, hey, like I'm also being accepted as I am. And it's so funny because growing up in a predominantly military environment, like it tends to be very like conservative leaning. And so you have like my Black identity along with a very conservative sort of neighborhood. And then I'm gay. And so just like all of these things like on top of each other really created this sort of experience for me that I think is quite unique, and kind of trying to like escape out of this bubble of like whiteness almost. And so, fast forward to when it was time to go to college, I was like, well, maybe I'll try going to an HBCU. Let's, it's so silly to say this now, but I thought at the time going to an HBCU would teach me how to be Black, like how to be, how to like, which sounds like wild, but one thing that, I don't think is often talked about is sort of the experience of Black women, Black girls who grew up in these like predominantly white suburbs, and sort of like their experiences and their identities with that. And, people thinking that you're just like this whitewashed Black person. And so when it was time to go to college, like I was like, well, I'm gonna go to an HBCU. I'm gonna learn to be Black. And so my freshman year of college, I I went to an HBCU, and I like to say that I had a lot of fun there. So much fun that I I had to withdraw at the end of my freshman year because I had too fun of a time and my GPA suffered. Um, but in that experience of going to an HBCU, I I took my first like African American history class, and it was so eye opening. Because in school, when you hear about Black history, you hear that we were once enslaved, that we were happy enslaved people, and that's like the watered down version. But there's so much more to our history than that. And so anyway, so I ended up transferring and subsequently graduating from University of Maryland, Baltimore County as an Africana Studies major. And and my specialty is Black women's history. That's what I've always loved. 20th century Black women's history, like reading about it, writing about it. And when I went to grad school, I also was a history major and just kind of like kept on with it. But it's just so It's so funny because, um, even being a historian now in kind of the field, when I tell people that I specialize in African American history, and not just African American history, but like Black women's history, they're like, "Oh, well, duh, that makes sense." But I'm like, "No, no, no, no. Like, I could have picked something else." It just so happened that when I took these classes in college, like a spark went off in my head, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I like Black women, we are the backbone of this country. We built this country, you know, like, and no disrespect to Black men, but like without the caretaking of Black women, without our sacrifices, our labor, like this country would not be where it is today." So it just like spoke to me, and I stuck with it. And moving forward, I just always did exhibits related to African American history or women's history. And now I work as a historian. I like to say that I am a historian who specializes in the museum field, simply because there are some historians that like they might work in a library, they might work for a school system, they might be a professor, but I specifically focused in on museums because I wanted to bring our stories to the public, and have other like Black little girls be able to look at my exhibits and say like, "Wow, I see myself represented here."
And that's so important too, because I think the first time I ever saw or felt as though I saw myself in a museum, and I love museums as well,
Yeah.
is when I went to the African American Museum in Washington, D.C.
Yes,
And I
yes.
spent, I think I spent the entire day there.
Hmm.
And like, it wasn't like sometimes people go to museums and like they're talking to their friends and they're talking with whoever. I was quiet, like, I was legitimately reading everything. Um, so that's very cool to hear. But my last question for you is, do you have any advice for your younger self?
So, advice to my younger self. Number one, like, don't spend so much time worrying if I'm making the right career choice. And the reason being, when you tell people you want to be a historian or do something in the humanities, the arts, everyone's like, "How are you gonna get a job? Like, you're not gonna make any money." And we live in such a capitalistic society that like everybody acts like money is everything. But peace of mind and happiness in your job is far more important than any amount of money. And I remember being in college, going back and forth between pre-law political science and being a history major. And my parents were really, really pushing for me to like go to law school. And if I'm being 100% honest, every now and again, they still are like, "Camille, it's not too late. Plenty of lawyers, like people go to law school in their 30s and stuff." And I'm like, "Nope, nope, nope, it's too late for me." Um, but so I would say like don't worry about what everyone else says. And then number two, to a second piece of advice that I would tell my younger self, really focus in on finding mentors and people who you kind of see, who kind of have the career that you see yourself having. So, for example, I was fortunate to grow up outside of DC, and DC has tons of museums, and quite a number of like Black curators. And so early on, like when I was in college, I'm like, okay, like this particular person, let me reach out, send an email and say, "Hey, like I'm loving the work you're doing. I'm loving your research. Like, do you have the capacity to take on a mentee?" And really take the time to nurture that relationship and learn from them. I would not be where I'm at today in my career if it hadn't been for all of uh, the people that mentored me along the way, that would take the time to talk with me and say, "Hey, Camille, like this is where you shine at, and this area is where you struggle at in doing the work in museums." But yeah, I would say that. And also just if you don't see if you don't see a career or like something that you're passionate about, build it yourself, create it yourself. So for example, I'm particularly passionate about disability history, and I like to think about the intersections between Blackness, gender, and disability all in one. And there isn't really like a a ton of information about it, let alone exhibited in museums. And so it was particularly important to me when you mentioned the Anti-Racism Daily 28 Days of Black History virtual exhibit. It was important to me to like bring those kinds of stories to the forefront and say like, hey, disabled voices are part of Black history. They're part of the entire collective history of the United States. Um, and so, I said, well, there aren't enough stories about this. I'm just gonna like, I don't say create my own, but like really do the work to like bring these conversations to the forefront. We can always chart our own course and just, and the thanks, the gratitude that you get when you just do this kind of work, it it I mean, you can't put a price on it. It's just so fulfilling to me when people tell me, hey, like, I didn't know that there were disabled folks in the Black Panther Party, for example. They're like, I just didn't know. And I'm like, yeah. And like, they were pretty instrumental in various like disability rights issues back in the day. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering those questions. And I'm super excited about our conversation today. Today, we're going to be talking about being Black and knowing your history. So I definitely want to tap into, you talked about when you took your first African American Studies class, you kind of that spark.
Yeah.
So why, turn it into a career, if that makes sense?
Sure. So, growing up, kind of like you, I visited a lot of museums, and I like to say that I knew I wanted to be a historian before I actually knew I was going to be a historian. So, my earliest memory of like being involved in a like history space was visiting Colonial Williamsburg, which for those who kind of aren't from the East Coast, look up Colonial Williamsburg. It's basically a place where white folks dress up like it's the 1800s and reenact. Now that I'm older, I'm like, ooh, this is a little problematic. But at the time, I just thought it was cool to dress up. And so I remember visiting this place at like 8, 9 years old, and I'm like, oh, this is like, I didn't know all of this existed. And I just remember like tucking it away in the back of my brain, like, okay, people can do this for a living. But I didn't know that was like being a historian or like doing history work. And so fast forward to like high school, I just like took social studies. I had my first Black social studies teacher in high school, and kind of hearing her take on US history, I'm like, oh man, like this is just so eye opening. Learning about like women like Billie Holiday or Nina Simone and how they use song for activism for the Black community just was like, okay, this is really interesting. I think I want to do this. But still then I didn't know you could be a historian. I just thought I'll be a teacher. And I there's nothing wrong with being a teacher, but I thought like that was going to be my calling. And so when I went to college, I had entered college as a pre-law political science major because I was like, well, if you like history, maybe you go to law school, maybe you go do that. And it was my like first week of college. I had a professor named Dr. Woods, and he assigned us a paper to read on the Willie Lynch letters, which we now know has been debunked as there's no necessary historical accuracy to it. But essentially, the premise of the Willie Lynch letters at that time were. It was a document that talked about how enslaved folks were to be, bred for servitude, beaten, all sorts of stuff, just really harmful things. And my professor said, read it, write a 5-page response paper to it. What are your thoughts? How does it make you feel? And at that time, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a whole side of like um, slavery in this country that I just didn't have a clue. And so that was kind of like the first little flicker of a spark. And subsequently, as that semester in that particular course went on, I learned about sort of comedic studies, how like for some African Americans, they had kings and queens and other forms of dynasty and things like that in our past. And it's just like, wow, I had no idea any of this existed. Um, and I remember thinking, if this is new to me, well, gosh, like I can't be the only one that just didn't have a clue that this existed. And so in that moment, I said, all right, that's it. I'm going to be a historian. I didn't yet realize until the end of college that I was going to be a historian in the museum world. I thought I was going to be a high school teacher, and so my minor is actually in secondary education. And for a hot second, I did teach. I taught seventh grade and I taught 10th grade in Baltimore, and it was kind of funny because I am a very short person in real life. I'm only 5 feet tall, and I look tall on social media, but I'm actually quite short. And so the kids used to always think I was like one of them. And but yeah, so and while I'm on the story about just how I decided on museums as opposed to teaching, or to make the career switch, if you will, my junior year of college, we had to do an internship in my department. And there was a whole list of places we could intern as an Africana Studies major. BET headquarters in DC was one of the places. And I was determined. I said, I'm going to go to BET. I'm going to get on 106 in Park and I'm going to do that. And typical me back in the day, I was procrastinating and all of the slots got filled to intern with BET. So I was crushed. The last little kind of opening that there was for a small museum in Baltimore, the Maryland Historical Society. And they needed like a student, a history major, to like do some research, help design exhibits, things like that, and also do some of their education programming. And I was like, well, I mean, I guess I've never worked in a museum. I don't know anybody who works in a museum. I guess I'll do that. And I signed up. They selected me as an intern. And that was just like, that was it. I'm like, I'm sold. I want to build exhibits and do that forever. And it's so funny how, like, I tell you, if I had gotten that intern at BET, who knows where I'd be now? But but it was just like I loved it. I remember working at that museum in Baltimore when we'd have kids come in, like young Black children, and they would look at me and say how much it meant to them to like see me being the person who helped design the exhibit, or like how much it meant to them seeing someone who like looks like them leading the tour, things like that. And it meant so much to me. It meant so much to me. And so now, I love museums strictly. Like I like to say that I am in the museum world, like specifically for Black people. Like I am there telling our stories and really trying to make our stories matter because time and time again, this overall narrative of US history tells us that our history doesn't matter, that it should be cast to the wayside. And so I'm just here, one person trying to tell meaningful stories about the past.
And you're doing an amazing job.
Yeah. Yeah.
To touch on a few things,
Mhm.
I am huge on representation. My friends honestly are probably sick of me saying that word. Even like you said, like you had a black, it sounded like Black woman history
Yeah.
professor.
Mhm.
I have not had a single Black professor in all of my schooling, K through 12 or under. Um, and although I know that like I am an engineer and that's a very white male dominated field,
Mhm.
there's Black women that are out there that are engineers. I know that they are. So
Yes, there are.
that,
My wife is actually an engineer.
look at that.
She's an engineer, but you're right. There's like, it's such a white male dominated field.
And I feel I can make myself comfortable, in
Mhm.
certain spaces like that because I've grown to understand how to kind of make space for myself.
Mhm.
But had I had,
Yeah.
a Black person be a professor and someone that I could talk to and connect with on that sort of level, I think would have been huge for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for those children to see a Black tour guide, like when I go to museums, I can't recall ever having a Black tour guide
Hmm.
throughout the museum or really in any like spaces. So like if
Hey,
I
yeah.
grew up in that white dominated
Mhm.
area and it was just me. So I very much I understand what you're saying.
Yes.
It's so cool that you kind of saw an area that you're like, hey, like it'd be really nice if our stories were shown, and then you took the step to actually do that because I feel like a lot of times people stop at, wow,
They,
someone should really, talk more
they,
about Black people and our experiences, and then it just like kind of stops there.
they do. And what's really interesting about that is it's so funny. I like to say that kind of the museum world before all of the George Floyd protests and everything like that last summer, before that, like I think museums were just like a little bit like complacent when it comes to like Black history, unless it was specifically an African American history museum. But now, with all of the things that happened last summer, they're like, okay, wait a minute, maybe we actually need to sit down and talk about this history, and not just talk about it, but like actually have people on staff um, who are making these decisions. And, I'll just be completely transparent. Many of the museums that I've worked at, I've worked at big museums like Smithsonian, but I've also worked at a lot of small museums. And with some of these smaller museums, I'm often the first, the only Black curator. And for folks who kind of don't know much about the museum world, the curator is I like to say the curator is they're the person whose name is usually the most public facing outside of like the director. So the curator designs the exhibit or the show, they select the artifacts, they write all the information that goes with it. So the curator is usually the person whose name is like like if you think of a movie, like they're the starring role. And then you have other roles like education department and collections manager who decides how to take care of an artifact. And so to be a curator in the museum world, a Black curator is, oh gosh, it's just like, it's so much pressure because like your name is going out there publicly. And I cannot tell you how many times when I've been at certain museums, um, as like the Black curator, and I say, hey, like we need to do inclusive exhibits, not just about Black people, about Asian communities, about Latino communities, about disabled communities, all sorts of stuff. Um, and people say, well, you just want to do it because you're Black. Like, and I'm like, no, I want to do it because those stories matter. Or to the same notion or to the same point where people might say oh I would never would have realized that that particular artifact was offensive uh, and I'm like yeah you're a white woman, why would you realize and actually that's on my mind because that happened to me recently um, where I had to inform colleagues that hey this is actually racist. Like we should not put that on display. But the the museum world will like I love museums with my whole heart, but I will say that when we have topics like why aren't there more Black people in museums as far as on the staffing side of things, and the reason being is that museums have a long way to go with like inclusion, diversity, who they allow into the doors, who they don't allow, and there unfortunately is a very high turnover rate for Black and Brown museum professionals simply for the fact that like it gets old very quickly after a while with all of the racism, the microaggressions, the it weighs on you. And I know for me, every now and again, like if I go to conferences or things like that, um, and people like, "What do you do, Camille?" And I'm like the curator. Like I am the person like the museum that I was previously at. I was the director of curation, like the person in charge. And somebody said to me, "Well, oh, you're not like a docent. You're not like a volunteer, or like." And I'm like, no, like I am the person in charge. And just kind of, making that assumption that I'm like an intern, not that there's anything wrong with an intern, but like respect my knowledge, respect what I'm bringing to the table. Um, so it's just like, you deal with like things like that. But it keeps me here. I'm like, somebody's got to do this work, and I don't mind, bucking the system and like uh, challenging, certain folks' levels of comfort so that we can progress forward.
Hmm. And I think that's unfortunately such a normal thing for a lot of Black women in any space that they find themselves in. It's almost as if you have to prove yourself just to say something. Um, and like that happens with me in engineering. Thankfully, my team currently is like very, very cool. But with
Yeah.
undergrad, it was like any group project I had to be in, like I had to say something really, really intelligent for them
Hmm.
to listen to my ideas moving forward. And it was like,
Yeah.
okay.
So funny because, and that's exactly it. Like I have to, I put pressure on myself to automatically be like bigger, better, stronger than anybody else in the room. And I'm like, I shouldn't have to do that. Like, I shouldn't have to, like, it's so funny because my therapist likes to say, like, carry yourself with like the attitude of a mediocre white man. Like if they're half-assing, like you don't have to like go above and beyond. And she's so right. Why is it as Black women particularly that we have to like that we have this pressure placed upon us,
Mhm.
like we're not smart enough to be there, like we're not. And it's like, no, like we got in this door based on our hard work and our merits. Stop trying to do everything to like push us out.
Mhm. That's so funny.
Yeah, I
I feel
know.
like because
Yeah.
I jokingly talk to like my close friends about that because it's like a lot of white white men, it's really white men can really
Yeah,
do the absolute minimum, like
they do.
very average at anything and still can look at me and try and like gatekeep whatever we're doing.
Mhm.
What?
Yes. Yes.
Um it's unfortunate, but I do agree that although I put pressure on myself, and I think a lot of Black women do in general,
Mhm.
almost it's natural to. Unfortunately, we do have to kind of take a step back and understand why we're doing it, um, and if it's because we feel the need to, like from external sources, we need to
Mhm.
kind of dismantle that. If it's from an internal source, we of course have to unpack it a little bit more. Um, but to shift a little bit, I would love to hear about your work with Antiracism Daily. Again, you of course worked on the 28 days of Black History, and I would love to know if you have like kind of like a favorite thing that you know liked while you're working on it, or a least favorite thing. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah.
Yeah. So, first, I will say that I was really excited when Nicole, the creator of Antiracism Daily, reached out to me. Nicole and I were actually friends prior to Antiracism Daily. Yeah, we actually like are friends in real life.
Cool.
And she's such a cool woman. She is. I first came to know Nicole through her work with Yoga Journal magazine, and she's a former yoga teacher. I don't believe she's still teaching these days, but she's a former yoga teacher. And essentially, she'd done a cover shoot with Yoga Journal magazine, and they put her picture up against another very well-known white yoga teacher, and they had their members vote on which cover they liked the best, which it was like super, super racist. Um, and I just happened to Nicole was doing like a tour around that time, and she happened to be visiting DC where I was living. And I said, hey, I saw how Yoga Journal treated you. Like, that is just unacceptable. And I shared a little bit of my own experience in the yoga world because I also teach yoga. And we just like hit it off. We like really hit it off. And she's also, I like to say, a pint-sized powerhouse because she's 5 feet tall as well. Um, and so, we've been friends for a while now. And when she reached out to me to do Anti-Racism Daily, one of her many, many projects, she always has her hands in multiple things, which I love. But she reached out to me with the idea to do sort of a 28-day virtual exhibit online of Black history, but really talking about Black history outside of the the names and figures that we often hear. So you always hear like MLK, Rosa Parks. You hear those names time and time again, um, and so it was really important to Nicole to share stories of Black history that you may not have learned in school, or um, stories that you might not realize were like a part of Black history. And when I spoke with Nicole, I said, absolutely, I'll do this 100%. And I said, it's important to me to um, tell stories of queer folks, trans folks, disabled folks, women, I mean, all sorts. And I said, I also want to tell stories of people who might not necessarily have the name recognition, but are still very important to Black history in this country. And she was like, absolutely. And so, really, kind of how we set the project up was we selected 28 different artifacts. And basically, these were sources, videos, songs, books, all sorts of things that people could actually, print out, buy, watch. Um, and then um, and then I or Nicole or someone on our team, we write a little something about it and say why we selected this artifact, um, just to get people really engaged with material, because I think it's one thing to just sit back and read on your phone, but when you're able to watch, or you can buy a book, knowing that you're supporting a Black bookstore, a Black-owned bookstore, for example, it just does something more.
Mhm.
For me, probably my probably favorite portion of the entire project. I love to research, so it was just nice to um, select things that are important to me. Oftentimes, when I'm working for a museum, like even now, I have to show what they have in their collection and like what the museum deems important. But with this particular project, it was me. Like I'm like, this is what's important to me.
Mhm.
Um, let's see, least favorite portion. Oh my gosh, it was like, where did the time go? When like I swear it's like I blinked and it was launch day. I was, Nicole had shared this, I think, on her Instagram a few weeks ago for Anti-Racism Daily, but we were so nervous the day before we launched, that people wouldn't support, they wouldn't subscribe, they wouldn't we were terrified because the day before, I think the Anti-Racism Daily page might have had like 2 or 3 thousand followers. Like it wasn't really a big amount.
Mhm.
Um, and then we launched it, and oh my goodness, we like people were emailing and reaching out and commenting and sharing and like all over, and it was the best thing that could have happened. I mean, I will tell you, like I was so nervous for my portion of the work. I'm like, what if people hate what I've written? What if it doesn't resonate? What if they're like, oh my gosh, Camille, you didn't talk enough about X, Y, and Z? Like I was so nervous. But then when people, like yourself, reached out and told me how much it meant to them, I was like, oh, yes.
It's awesome, like fantastic, but continue.
Yeah. So I was really nervous. So I'm glad it resonated with people, and I am hopeful that another project like this will happen in the future. I would love to do something like this for LGBT History Month, for example, like a 28 days virtual exhibit. So I would love to do something like that. But I'm just glad that we were able to give this resource for free, and that people could interact, could learn, and just one more thing on the exhibit. I really saw it for for myself as like a love letter, a love offering to the Black community. Like that is who I did this for. It just so happens everybody else got to bear witness to it and learn. But like I was like, no, this is like by us, for us, about us. And so I'm glad that it like really, um that it made people happy and think, engage in a way that they might not have otherwise engaged.
So to wrap up, is there anything else that you want the viewers to know?
Ooh, let's see. Gosh, what else? I don't know. You can find me on Instagram at Curating
Mhm.
Camille and Twitter. I am always working consulting. I like to say that I'm very friendly. So if you ever have history questions, you want to know my journey, you want to know how to like make a career out of this, please reach out. I like to think of myself as someone who, like I didn't get where I'm at on my own. So anytime I'm able to reach back and say like, hey, here's what I did, I'm happy to do that. And then as far as what's next for me, like on projects, I'll just share. I am currently filming webinars on Black disability history in museums. So you'll have to follow my Instagram and my Twitter. Again, they're both at Curating Camille for when those go live, which I'm pretty excited about. And yeah, I think that's what's coming next.
Awesome. I will put Camille's Instagram and Twitter in the description box. Again, Camille, this means a lot to me.
Yes.
And I'm sure as you've been able to receive those words of affirmation over all of Black History Month and hopefully before,
Yeah.
what you're doing really means a lot. And to be able to see people that look like me in my email every night has been fantastic. I actually read the emails right before I go to bed.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
So,
And once again, I'm glad you reached out. I love when I meet other people with the same name as me because just like quick funny story. Growing up, I hated my name. I wanted to be like, yes, I didn't want to be a Camille. Like I was like, nobody has that name. I want a popular name, like
yes,
a Brittany or something
like
like
Emily.
yeah. You never see my name on like keychains and like gas stations or souvenir shops. I was like, I never see my name. I don't like my name.
Mhm.
Um, but then once I got older, I was like, I really like my name. Like it's a
Mhm.
good name. People will remember it. And yeah, so I was like, she's got the same name as me. Now I really got to do this.
It's actually funny because I think, well, actually, no, I know you are the first Camille that I've ever met.
Yeah.
So I'm very happy to share a name with you.
Yes. Yes.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
And again, thank you so, so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you.
Watching. Thank you for tuning in to this episode. Please come back for weekly episodes on my YouTube or my Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.
Thank you.